I never thought bumping into a stranger at a werewolf mating ceremony would save my life, until I realized the man holding me wasn't who he claimed to be, and the woman who helped me escape my abusive ex had been hunting me all along. My name is Seraphina, I'm blind, and 3 minutes ago I discovered I can see the future. Oh, and the Alpha King whose arms I'm trembling in? He's been dead for 50 years. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. This story actually starts 3 months ago, when I made the worst decision of my life, leaving the man who'd been slowly killing my soul, one cruel word at a time. I thought escaping Marcus was the hardest thing I'd ever do. I had no idea it was exactly what they wanted me to do. Chapter 1, The Stranger's Arms. The metallic scent of blood filled Seraphina's nostrils as rough fingers dug into her wrist, dragging her through the crowded ceremony hall. You thought you could hide from me forever? Marcus snarled, his breath hot against her ear. The blind Omega stumbled, her white cane clattering to the marble floor as panic seized her chest. Around them, the annual mating ceremony continued, hundreds of voices creating a wall of sound that swallowed her desperate gasps. She couldn't see the faces turning toward the commotion, couldn't gauge how many witnesses might help or simply watch her destruction unfold. Please, Marcus, not here, Seraphina whispered, her voice breaking as his grip tightened enough to bruise. The scent of his rage, bitter and acidic, made her stomach churn. 3 months of hiding, 3 months of sleeping in shelters and counting every penny, all destroyed because she dared to attend the one event that promised hope for wolves like her. The mating ceremony was supposed to be sacred, a place where even the most vulnerable could find protection. But Marcus had never respected sacred things, especially not when they stood between him and what he believed he owned. In her desperation to escape his crushing grip, Seraphina broke free and stumbled backward, directly into someone's chest. Strong arms caught her before she could fall, and suddenly she was surrounded by a scent that made her wolf whimper with recognition. Pine forests after rain. Wild honey. Something ancient and powerful that spoke to the deepest part of her soul. I'm so sorry, she gasped, trying to pull away from the stranger she'd accidentally embraced. But the arms around her tightened protectively, and a low growl rumbled from the chest against her cheek, a sound that made every conversation in the hall die to absolute silence. Don't move, the stranger commanded, his voice carrying an authority that made her bones vibrate. Seraphina felt the subtle shift in the air as every wolf in the ceremony hall submitted to that tone, including Marcus, whose furious snarling cut off abruptly. The man holding her smelled like power itself, not the cruel dominance Marcus wielded like a weapon, but something deeper, more primal. Something that made her damaged Omega instinct sing with desperate hope even as her rational mind screamed warnings. She couldn't see his face, but she could feel the weight of his gaze as he studied Marcus over her head. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, broken only by Seraphina's ragged breathing and the thunderous beating of her heart. She had no idea who she'd stumbled into, but the protective cage of his arms felt safer than anywhere she'd been in months. Marcus hadn't spoken, Marcus, who never stopped talking, never stopped threatening. That terrified her more than his violence ever had, because it meant this stranger commanded a level of respect that could either save her life or destroy it completely. As golden eyes blazed in the darkness she couldn't see, Seraphina realized she'd just changed the course of her fate by accident, and there would be no going back. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in the Philippines, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. The rain hammered against the cracked window of the homeless shelter as Seraphina pressed her face against the cold glass, listening to the storm that matched the chaos in her heart. 3 weeks had passed since she'd finally found the courage to leave Marcus, 3 weeks of sleeping on strangers' couches and rationing granola bars like they were gourmet meals. Her fingers traced the healing bruises on her throat, purple fingerprints that served as a reminder of the night she'd almost died. He said he'd kill me if I ever left, she whispered to her reflection, though the words felt hollow now. She'd already died a little more each day she'd stayed, watching her dreams shrivel under his constant criticism and control. The memory of that final night still made her hands shake. Marcus had come home drunk again, reeking of another woman's perfume and spoiling for a fight. When she'd quietly asked about dinner plans, he'd exploded with a rage that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than alcohol. His hands around her throat, her vision going black, the terrifying moment when she'd realized he might actually follow through on his threats this time. Only her neighbors pounding on the wall had broken the spell, and in that moment of distraction, she'd grabbed her cane and run into the night wearing nothing but pajamas and yesterday's fear. Now, surrounded by the soft snores of other displaced souls, Seraphina clutched the crumpled flyer she'd found in the shelter's community room. The mating ceremony, an ancient tradition where unmated wolves could find their destined partners under the protection of the pack's most sacred laws. She'd attended once before, years ago, filled with hopeful dreams of finding someone who would love her despite her blindness. Instead, she'd met Marcus, whose initial kindness had slowly transformed into possessive obsession. The memory of his sweet courtship felt like a cruel joke now, all those gentle touches that had gradually become restraints. "Maybe I'm not meant for love," she murmured, folding the flyer with careful precision. The other women in the shelter talked about their dreams, new jobs, reconciliation with family, fresh starts in different cities. But Seraphina's dreams felt smaller, more fragile. A safe place to sleep. A day without fear. Someone who might see her strength instead of her disability, her spirit instead of her scars. The mating ceremony represented hope, but it also represented risk. If Marcus found her there, surrounded by the pack's elite, her humiliation would be complete and very public. As thunder shook the building's tired foundations, Seraphina made a decision that would either save her life or destroy what little remained of it. She would attend the ceremony, not because she believed in fairy tale endings, but because she refused to let Marcus's shadow define the rest of her existence. If she was going to fall, she would fall reaching for something better, not cowering in the darkness he'd created around her. The rain continued its relentless assault against the window, but for the first time in months, Seraphina smiled. She had 3 weeks to prepare, 3 weeks to gather the courage that had gotten her this far. 3 weeks until she would discover that sometimes the most dangerous choices led to the most extraordinary destinations. 6 blocks away from the shelter, Damon Blackthorne stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the same storm rage across the city he ruled. The reflection in the glass showed a man who looked 35 but had lived for centuries, whose golden eyes held the weight of decisions that affected thousands of pack members across 3 states. The quarterly reports scattered across his mahogany desk painted a picture of prosperity and growth, but the Alpha King's mind was focused on darker concerns. 3 pack members had gone missing in the past month, all from the city's most vulnerable populations, and the council was pressuring him to increase security measures that would only create more fear. "The mating ceremony preparations are complete, Alpha," his beta, Kieran, announced from the doorway, though his tone carried undertones of concern. Damon turned from the window, noting the tension in his second's shoulders. In their 60-year partnership, Kieran had never hidden his worries about the annual event that brought hundreds of unmated wolves into the heart of their territory. This year felt different, more dangerous, more unpredictable. The recent disappearances had everyone on edge, and intelligence suggested that a rogue pack from the Eastern Territories was planning some kind of disruption. But canceling the ceremony would signal weakness to their enemies and despair to their people. The irony wasn't lost on Damon that he, the most powerful alpha in North America, would attend another mating ceremony without hope of finding his own mate. 500 years of searching, 500 years of watching other wolves find their destined partners while his soul remained achingly empty. He'd long ago accepted that the moon goddess had different plans for him, plans that apparently involved leading their kind into an uncertain future without the anchor of a true mate bond. The loneliness was a constant companion now, as familiar as his own heartbeat, as persistent as the power that both blessed and cursed him. "Increase security around the perimeter," Damon commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had ended wars and toppled enemies. "But keep it subtle. Our people need to feel safe, not imprisoned. He moved to his desk, fingers trailing over the guest list that included some of the most prominent names in their world, and some of the most vulnerable. Every year, he watched desperate Omegas arrive with hope shining in their eyes, searching for protection and love in equal measure. Some found their happiness, but others discovered that predators often wore sheep's clothing to these sacred events. As lightning illuminated the city below, Damon felt an unusual restlessness stirring in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in decades. His wolf paced beneath his skin, anticipating something that his logical mind couldn't identify. Perhaps it was simply the approaching storm, or the weight of responsibility that grew heavier each year. But as he looked out at the sheltered district where so many of his people struggled to survive, something whispered that this ceremony would be different. This year, fate had plans that would challenge everything he thought he knew about destiny, power, and the price of love. The storm was just beginning, and Damon Blackthorne had no idea that in 3 weeks, his entire world would shift on its axis because of one blind Omega's desperate courage. Chapter 2: The Dress and the Decision. The morning of the mating ceremony dawned gray and uncertain, with clouds threatening rain that would turn the evening's outdoor portion into a muddy disaster. Seraphina sat on the edge of her narrow shelter bed, running her fingers over the second-hand dress that had cost her 3 days' worth of meal vouchers. The pale blue fabric felt like silk beneath her touch, though she knew it was probably polyester, and the previous owner had left behind a faint scent of hope and lavender. Mrs. Chen from the shelter's volunteer staff had helped her find it, describing the way the color brought out the silver highlights in Seraphina's dark hair and made her gray eyes look like storm clouds. "You clean up real nice, honey," Mrs. Chen had said while helping her practice walking in the borrowed heels that were half a size too small. But Seraphina felt like a fraud, a broken Omega playing dress-up for one night, pretending she was worthy of the kind of love the ceremony promised. The other shelter residents had gathered around her with encouraging smiles and gentle touches, sharing lipstick and hairpins like she was heading to prom instead of what might be her last desperate attempt at finding safety. Their kindness made her throat tight with emotion, because these women understood what it meant to rebuild yourself from nothing. The invitation in her purse felt heavier than paper, a formal acceptance that had arrived 3 days after her application, bearing the official seal of the Blackthorne Pack. Seraphina had traced the raised lettering with trembling fingers, hardly daring to believe that someone like her had been approved to attend the most exclusive event in their supernatural world. The background check alone should have disqualified her, given Marcus's reputation and the domestic violence reports that painted her as damaged goods. But somehow, her application had been accepted, and now she was minutes away from stepping into a world where she desperately didn't belong. As she applied the borrowed makeup with careful precision, Seraphina caught her reflection in the cracked mirror above the shared bathroom sink. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, elegant, determined, almost beautiful in the way that sorrow sometimes carved interesting angles into a person's face. The bruises were gone now, hidden beneath concealer and time, but the wariness in her eyes remained. She'd practiced her story dozens of times, recently moved to the city, looking for a fresh start, hopeful about finding her destined mate. None of it was technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth would send any potential mate running for the hills. "This is your chance," she whispered to her reflection, straightening the dress one final time. Outside, a taxi waited to take her to the Grand Celestial Hotel, where werewolf royalty and hopeful romantics would gather under crystal chandeliers and the blessing of ancient traditions. Seraphina had no way of knowing that across town, the Alpha King was adjusting his own formal attire with the same nervous energy, or that their paths were about to converge in a way that would rewrite both their destinies. As she picked up her white cane and headed for the door, leaving behind the safety of anonymity for the dangerous promise of transformation, the first drops of rain began to fall. The storm that had been building for weeks was finally ready to break, and nothing would ever be the same. The Grand Celestial Hotel's ballroom glittered like a scene from a fairy tale, with crystal chandeliers casting rainbows across marble floors and silk-draped walls that whispered of old money and older power. Seraphina paused in the entrance, overwhelmed by the symphony of scents that assaulted her heightened senses. Expensive perfumes layering over the natural musk of hundreds of werewolves, the metallic tang of nervous excitement, and beneath it all, the alpha pheromones that made her omega instincts flutter with anticipation and anxiety. Her cane tapped against the marble as she navigated toward the scent of champagne and safety, trying to blend into the crowd despite feeling like a spotlight was following her every movement. Well, well. Look what crawled out of the gutter. The voice froze her blood, and Seraphina's grip tightened on her cane as Marcus materialized beside her like a nightmare-given form. He looked exactly the same, dark hair perfectly styled, expensive suit that couldn't hide the cruel curve of his smile, the predatory way he moved through space as if he owned everything in it. But there was something different about his scent tonight, something sharper and more dangerous that made her wolf whimper in terror. 3 months of freedom evaporated in an instant, replaced by the suffocating weight of his presence and the memories of nights when his hands had been weapons instead of comfort. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Seraphina managed, hating how small her voice sounded in the vast space. Around them, other ceremony guests continued their conversations, unaware that her entire world was crumbling in real time. Marcus stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough that his scent overwhelmed everything else and made her stomach churn with remembered fear. His hand shot out to grip her wrist, fingers finding the exact spots where old bruises had faded, and she bit back a gasp of pain that would only encourage him further. "You belong to me," he whispered, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear the venom beneath his public facade. "Did you really think a fancy dress and some borrowed confidence would change that? You're still the same broken little omega who couldn't survive a day without me. Look around, Seraphina. Look at all these powerful wolves with their perfect lives. What makes you think any of them would want damaged goods?" His words hit their target with surgical precision, each one designed to reinforce the prison of self-doubt he'd spent years building around her heart. She could feel herself shrinking, her hard-won confidence melting under the assault of his psychological warfare. But as his grip tightened and his threats continued, something shifted in the air around them, a presence so powerful it made the chandeliers above them chime like wind bells. Seraphina felt it first as a change in the room's energy, then as a scent that cut through Marcus's malice like sunlight through storm clouds. Pine forests and wild honey, ancient strength and protective fury, something that made her wolf lift its head for the first time in months and whisper a single word, "Alpha." The hand on her wrist loosened as Marcus's attention snapped toward whatever was approaching, and for the first time since he'd appeared, Seraphina heard uncertainty creep into his voice. "Who the hell?" he began, but his words died as golden eyes emerged from the crowd, burning with a fire that promised either salvation or destruction, and Seraphina realized that her night was about to become infinitely more complicated. Damon Blackthorne moved through the crowd like a force of nature, his formal black tuxedo doing nothing to disguise the predatory grace that marked him as apex among alphas. He'd been watching the exchange from across the ballroom, his enhanced hearing picking up every venomous word the male was hissing at the blind Omega, every tremor in her voice as she tried to maintain her dignity under assault. Something primal and furious had awakened in his chest at the sight, a protective instinct so fierce it had taken all his self-control not to shift and tear the bastard's throat out in front of 300 witnesses. Instead, he'd forced himself to move with calculated calm, each step designed to intimidate without appearing threatening to the innocent bystanders. The crystal chandeliers above cast shifting patterns of light across the marble floor as Damon navigated between clusters of werewolf elite, his golden eyes never leaving the tableau unfolding near the champagne fountain. The Omega's scent had reached him even across the vast ballroom, rain and resilience, vanilla and something else, something ancient and powerful that made his wolf pace restlessly beneath his human facade. In 5 centuries of existence, he'd never encountered anything quite like it, never felt his supernatural senses respond with such immediate recognition. There was magic in her blood, old magic that sang to the deepest parts of his alpha nature in ways he couldn't begin to understand. "Is there a problem here?" Damon's voice carried the kind of authority that ended wars, and he watched with grim satisfaction as the male, Marcus, according to the guest list, went pale beneath his tan. The Omega beside him hadn't turned around yet, but he could see the way her entire body had relaxed at his approach, as if some part of her recognized him as safety even without seeing his face. She smelled like rain and resilience, vanilla and hidden strength, something that made his wolf prowl restlessly beneath his skin in a way he hadn't experienced in centuries. But there was something else beneath those surface scents, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up with supernatural awareness. Marcus's hand dropped from the Omega's wrist as if she'd suddenly caught fire, and Damon noted with cold fury the finger-shaped red marks already forming on her pale skin. Alpha Blackthorn, Marcus stammered, attempting a respectful bow that looked more like a nervous twitch. I was just. Seraphina and I have history. I was welcoming her to the ceremony. The lies rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, but Damon had spent 5 centuries learning to read deception in all its forms. More importantly, he caught something else in Marcus's scent: satisfaction, possessiveness, and underneath it all, the metallic tang of someone who'd been feeding off supernatural power that wasn't his own. The Omega, Seraphina, had gone very still beside them, and he could smell her fear spiking despite his presence. But there was something else radiating from her now, something that made Damon's alpha instincts sharpen to a razor's edge. Power. Raw, untapped, carefully contained power that pulsed beneath her skin like a second heartbeat. Whatever Marcus had been doing to her, whatever hold he'd maintained over her for years, it involved more than simple emotional abuse. This was about control over something far more valuable and dangerous than a broken Omega's heart. Seraphina, Damon repeated, letting her name roll across his tongue like a prayer. It suited her, beautiful and ethereal, with sharp edges hidden beneath the surface. When she finally turned toward him, her gray eyes were wide with confusion and something that might have been hope, and he felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. She couldn't see him, but she tilted her head like she was listening to something only she could hear, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. You're the one who smells like safety. The words hit him like a physical blow, so honest and vulnerable that every protective instinct he possessed roared to life. But as their gazes met, hers unseen yet somehow penetrating, his burning with golden fire, Damon noticed something that made his breath catch. For just a moment, the faintest flicker of silver light had danced across her irises, like lightning trapped behind storm clouds. It was gone so quickly he might have imagined it, but his supernatural senses were screaming that he'd just witnessed something impossible. Something that suggested her blindness wasn't what it appeared to be, that there were layers to this woman's story that went far deeper than an abusive relationship and a desperate search for safety. Dance with me, he said, extending his hand toward her and watching Marcus's face cycle through shock, rage, and something that looked disturbingly like panic. It wasn't a request. Alpha Kings didn't make requests at their own ceremonies, but he kept his voice gentle for her sake. When Seraphina reached out with trembling fingers and placed her hand in his, something electric shot up his arm and settled in the region of his heart like a key finding its lock. But more than that, the moment their skin made contact, power surged between them like a completed circuit, and he felt something ancient and carefully contained stir to life beneath her human facade. Around them, the ballroom had gone completely silent, 300 pairs of eyes watching their Alpha King claim a dance with an unknown Omega while her ex-mate stood by helplessly. But Damon was barely aware of the audience, his entire focus consumed by the woman whose small hand fit so perfectly in his own. As he led her toward the dance floor, leaving Marcus seething in their wake, he felt the power radiating from her skin intensify with each step, as if his touch was awakening something that had been forced into dormancy. The orchestra struck up a waltz as they reached the center of the polished marble floor, and Damon gathered Seraphina into his arms with the reverence of a man handling priceless crystal. Her body fit against his like it had been designed for this moment, her natural grace allowing her to follow his lead despite her inability to see their steps. But as they began to move together, something extraordinary happened. The silver light he'd glimpsed in her eyes began to intensify, flickering like candle flames behind her gray irises, and her breathing quickened in a way that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of dancing. Something's happening, Seraphina whispered, her voice tight with confusion and growing alarm. I can see, but not see. There are lights, shapes, moving like shadows behind my eyes. What's happening to me? Her grip on his hand tightened until her nails bit into his skin, and Damon could feel the power building beneath her surface like a dam about to burst. Whatever had been suppressing her abilities for years was beginning to crack under the influence of his alpha energy, and the results were clearly terrifying her. "Stay with me," Damon murmured, spinning her slowly while his mind raced to understand what he was witnessing. The scent of magic was growing stronger around them, not the clean, natural magic of werewolf transformation, but something older, wilder, tinged with the metallic taste of blood sacrifice and ancient rituals. Someone had done this to her deliberately, had bound her abilities with the kind of power that required tremendous sacrifice and absolute ruthlessness. The question was why, and what those abilities might be when they finally broke free. As if summoned by his thoughts, Marcus appeared at the edge of the dance floor, his face a mask of barely controlled fury and something that looked disturbingly like desperation. "She needs to come with me," he called out, his voice pitched to carry across the ballroom. "She's having an episode. This happens sometimes, the stress, the crowds. I know how to help her." But even as he spoke, Damon could smell the lies rolling off him in waves, could see the calculation behind his supposed concern. Marcus knew exactly what was happening to Seraphina, had probably been controlling and suppressing these episodes for years. "No," Seraphina gasped, her body going rigid in Damon's arms as the silver light behind her eyes suddenly blazed like wildfire. "The lights are getting brighter. I can see, oh God, I can see things that haven't happened yet. There's blood, so much blood, and someone I trust is going to..." Her words cut off in a strangled scream as visions that had been suppressed for decades suddenly crashed through the weakening barriers in her mind like a supernatural tsunami. Damon felt the exact moment when the magical seal containing her oracle abilities finally shattered completely. Power exploded outward from Seraphina's small frame like a supernova, washing over every supernatural being in the ballroom with enough force to bring some of the weaker wolves to their knees. The crystal chandeliers above them rang like bells, their prisms casting rainbow patterns that seemed to dance in response to her unleashed abilities. And through it all, Seraphina stood frozen in his arms, her blind eyes now blazing with silver fire as visions of the past, present, and future crashed through her consciousness without mercy or filter. "I can see," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder and terror in equal measure. "Not with my eyes, but with something deeper. I can see the threads that connect all things, the patterns that show what was and what will be. And I can see..." Her gaze, still technically blind but somehow seeing far more than normal vision would allow, fixed on Marcus with devastating accuracy. "I can see what you did to me. What grandmother did to me. The binding ritual, the blood sacrifice, the way you've been feeding off my suppressed visions for years like some kind of supernatural parasite." The accusation hung in the air like a sword, and Marcus's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled completely. "You don't understand," he snarled, abandoning all pretense of civility as his own supernatural nature began to leak through his human form. "Those visions nearly killed you as a child. Your grandmother saved your sanity, saved your life by binding them. And yes, I learned to interpret the fragments that leaked through, but I was protecting you from the full force of..." "Protecting me?" Seraphina's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass, her newly awakened power making the air itself vibrate with energy. "You were using me. Feeding off my gift like a tick feeding off blood, getting just enough information to manipulate pack politics and business deals while keeping me helpless and dependent. The binding wasn't meant to protect me, it was meant to control me, to turn me into a resource that could be harvested without my knowledge or consent." Around them, the ballroom had erupted into chaos as the supernatural elite struggled to process what they were witnessing. Oracle blood hadn't appeared in their world for over 2 centuries, and the last true oracle had driven 3 packs to the brink of civil war before disappearing into legend. Now they were watching one awaken in the arms of the Alpha King himself, her power radiating outward in waves that made every wolf's instinct scream warnings about forces beyond their understanding or control. But Damon's attention was focused entirely on the woman in his arms, watching as decades of suppressed visions crashed through her consciousness like a dam bursting. Silver tears streamed down her cheeks as she witnessed moments of beauty and horror, love and betrayal, triumphs and tragedies that spanned centuries of werewolf history. Her gift was showing her everything: the secret alliances that shaped pack politics, the hidden betrayals that had sparked wars, the quiet moments of love and sacrifice that had saved lives no one would ever know about. The Eastern Pack, she gasped suddenly, her vision fixing on something in the near future that made her entire body convulse with terror. They're not just watching, they're planning something. They know what I am, what I've always been, and they're coming. Soon. They have someone on the inside, someone close to you who's been feeding them information, waiting for the right moment to. Her words cut off in another scream as the vision intensified, showing her details that made her supernatural awareness recoil in horror. What do you see? Damon demanded, his alpha power wrapping around her like armor against the psychic assault she was enduring. His touch seemed to stabilize her somehow, allowing her to focus on specific visions instead of being overwhelmed by the cosmic flow of information that wanted to pour through her awakened consciousness. Tell me what's coming, Seraphina. Let me help you process this. Through the chaos of awakening oracle sight, Seraphina found his voice like an anchor in the storm. They're planning to use the mate bond, she whispered, her blind eyes somehow finding his with perfect accuracy. Once it's complete, once we're fully bonded, they can use me to influence you, to manipulate your decisions through the psychic connection we'll share. And if that doesn't work? Her vision shifted to something even more horrifying, something that made her supernatural awareness recoil with instinctive terror. They'll kill me in a way that will destroy you through the bond, leaving the throne open for their own candidate. The revelation hit Damon like a physical blow, confirming suspicions he'd harbored for months about the Eastern Pack's unusual interest in his territory. They weren't just planning a coup, they were planning to use his own mate bond as a weapon against him, turning the most sacred connection in werewolf culture into an instrument of psychological warfare. The sophistication of the plan, the patient years of positioning and manipulation, spoke to an intelligence network that went far deeper than he'd imagined. But there's more, Seraphina continued, her oracle sight piercing through layers of deception and misdirection to reveal truths that made her soul ache with the weight of cosmic knowledge. Someone in your inner circle has been working with them from the beginning. Someone who's been close enough to observe your routines, your weaknesses, your deepest fears. The betrayal is going to come from within, and when it does. She paused, her vision showing her flashes of a future too horrible to put into words. When it does, everything you've built will burn. As the magnitude of the conspiracy became clear, Damon felt something cold and deadly settle in his chest. For centuries, he'd protected his pack through strength and cunning, always staying one step ahead of his enemies through careful planning and ruthless efficiency. But this threat was different, personal in a way that made his alpha rage burn white-hot with the need for immediate violence. They weren't just targeting his territory or his throne. They were targeting the one person in 500 years who had made his soul feel complete. "We need to leave," he said, his voice carrying the kind of command that made every wolf in hearing range submit instinctively. "Now. Before whoever's working with them realizes what you've seen and decides to accelerate their timeline." But even as he spoke, Seraphina's newly awakened oracle sight was showing her something that made her supernatural awareness scream with warning. "It's too late," she whispered, her blind eyes fixed on the ballroom entrance where figures in expensive evening wear were making their way through the crowd with predatory purpose. "They're already here." The Eastern Pack's advance team arrived during the ceremony, blending in with the other guests. "And they're inside contact." Her vision shifted to someone much closer, someone whose scent she'd been smelling all evening without recognizing the threat it represented. "Oh God, Damon. You're Beta. Kieran. He's the one who's been feeding them information. He's been planning this betrayal for years." The words hit Damon like a silver bullet to the heart, confirming his worst fears about trust and loyalty in the supernatural world. Kieran had been his right hand for over 60 years, his most trusted advisor, the wolf he'd relied on to help build and maintain everything he held dear. The idea that such a fundamental betrayal had been festering in the heart of his pack for years made something primal and dangerous stir to life in his chest. But there was no time to process the emotional devastation of Kieran's treachery, because Seraphina's oracle sight was showing her immediate danger approaching from multiple directions. "They're moving," she gasped, her awakened abilities allowing her to track the Eastern Pack operatives as they closed in from different angles. 3 from the north entrance, 2 from the service corridor, 1 coming down from the balcony level. "They're planning to take me alive, but they'll kill anyone who gets in their way. Including you." As if summoned by her words, the lights suddenly went out, plunging the ballroom into darkness that would have been absolute for human eyes but merely inconvenient for supernatural senses. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, casting eerie red shadows across the suddenly panicked crowd as Werewolf Elite realized they were trapped in the middle of what was clearly a coordinated attack on their Alpha King. "Stay close to me," Damon commanded, his body already beginning the shift toward his more dangerous form as golden eyes blazed in the artificial twilight. Around them, pack members were responding to the threat with military precision, but he could smell Kieran's scent moving through the crowd in a way that suggested coordination with the attackers rather than defense against them. The betrayal was already in motion, and they were surrounded by enemies wearing the faces of allies. But as Seraphina pressed against his side, her oracle abilities now fully awakened and functioning, Damon realized they had advantages their enemies couldn't have anticipated. She could see the attack patterns before they developed, could track their enemies' movements through supernatural sight that pierced through deception and misdirection like sunlight through fog. For the first time in centuries, he wasn't fighting blind against unknown enemies. 2 more seconds, Seraphina whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "Then duck and move left. There's a service door hidden behind the tapestry. It leads to a private elevator that goes directly to the parking garage. But we have to move now, before they realize what I can do and decide I'm too dangerous to take alive." As the first attacker lunged through the crowd toward them, Damon felt something he hadn't experienced in 500 years of existence, the perfect synchronization of fighting alongside someone who could see the battle from a cosmic perspective. With his mate's oracle sight guiding their movements and his own supernatural strength clearing their path, they became something their enemies had never prepared to face, a bonded pair fighting with the combined power of prophecy and primal fury. The war for Seraphina's freedom was just beginning, but for the first time since Marcus had grabbed her wrist in what felt like a lifetime ago, she was no longer fighting alone. And with her oracle abilities finally awakened and a true alpha at her side, even the Eastern Pack's carefully laid plans might not be enough to claim the prize they'd been hunting for years. Chapter 3: The Dance of Destiny. The orchestra's music swelled around them as Damon guided Seraphina onto the dance floor, her small hand trembling in his while his other arms settled protectively around her waist. She moved with surprising grace despite her blindness, following his lead with the kind of trust that spoke to generations of Omega instincts recognizing true alpha strength. "I don't even know your name," she whispered, tilting her head up toward his voice, and something about the way she looked at him, through him, made Damon feel more seen than he had in centuries. Her gray eyes held flecks of silver that caught the chandelier light, and he found himself drowning in depths that reflected wisdom far beyond her years. The ballroom seemed to fade around them as they moved together, the whispered conversations and clinking crystal glasses becoming mere background noise to the symphony of their shared heartbeats. Seraphina's oracle abilities, still raw and uncontrolled from their recent awakening, were sending her flashes of emotion and memory with every step. She could see fragments of Damon's past, centuries of loneliness, the weight of impossible decisions, the careful walls he'd built around his heart to protect himself from the kind of vulnerability that could destroy a leader. But beneath all that ancient pain, she glimpsed something that made her soul sing with recognition, a man who had been waiting his entire immortal existence for exactly this moment. "Damon," he murmured, spinning her slowly so her dress flared around her legs like water, drawing appreciative murmurs from the watching crowd. He didn't offer his title or pack name, wanting to exist in this bubble where he was just a man dancing with a woman who made his soul sing. But even as they moved together with increasing harmony, he could feel Marcus's furious gaze burning holes in his back, could scent the rage and wounded pride rolling off the other male in toxic waves. There was something else in Marcus's scent now, something that made Damon's supernatural instincts sharpen with warning, the metallic tang of desperation and the chemical signature of someone who knew their carefully laid plans were unraveling. "He hurt you," Damon said, statement rather than question, his voice dropping to the kind of low rumble that made Seraphina's omega purr with satisfaction even as her human mind tried to maintain proper boundaries. Through her awakened oracle sight, she could see the truth of Marcus's abuse written in the quantum threads that connected all things, not just the physical violence, but the systematic psychological warfare designed to break her spirit and make her dependent on his twisted version of protection. But there was something else in those visions, something that made her blood run cold with growing horror. "That's in the past," Seraphina replied, but her voice cracked on the lie as new visions crashed through her consciousness. She could see Marcus's connections now, the web of communication that linked him to forces far more dangerous than a single abusive ex-mate. Phone calls made in the dead of night, money changing hands, information about pack politics and supernatural bloodlines being traded like commodity futures. The Eastern Pack hadn't just stumbled across her existence, they'd been tracking her for months, maybe years, waiting for the right moment to make their move. The protective fury building in Damon's chest was unlike anything he'd experienced before, not the cold, calculated anger he wielded as a ruler, but something hot and personal that demanded immediate action. When he spun her again, he caught sight of Marcus advancing through the crowd, his face twisted with an entitlement that made Damon's vision tinge red around the edges. But there was something different about the way Marcus moved now, a confidence that suggested he wasn't acting alone, that backup was waiting somewhere in the shadows of the glittering ballroom. "The song isn't over," Marcus announced as he reached them, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure nearby couples could hear his challenge. But beneath his public bravado, Seraphina's oracle abilities were picking up something that made her supernatural awareness scream with warning. Marcus wasn't just here to reclaim what he considered his property, he was here to deliver her to someone else, someone whose plans for her newly awakened abilities were far more sinister than simple exploitation. Seraphina went rigid in Damon's arms, her sense spiking with terror so sharp it made his wolf snarl with the need to eliminate the threat. Through her oracle sight, she could see the immediate future branching into multiple possibilities, most of them ending in blood and betrayal. But this was a public ceremony, attended by pack leaders from across the region, and starting a blood feud on the dance floor would have political ramifications that could destabilize everything Damon had worked to build. "You're right," Damon said, his voice carrying just enough alpha command to make every wolf in hearing range submit instinctively. "The song isn't over. Which means you need to wait your turn." The words were polite enough on the surface, but the underlying threat was unmistakable: step back or face the consequences. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to realize exactly who he was challenging. The Alpha King's reputation wasn't built on mercy or second chances, and even a fool could read the promise of violence in those golden eyes. But instead of retreating as expected, Marcus did something that chilled Seraphina to the bone. He smiled. "Actually, Alpha King, I think you'll find that the song is about to change completely. You see, Seraphina isn't just any Omega. She's something far more valuable, something that certain interested parties have been tracking for quite some time. The Eastern Pack sends their regards, by the way. They're very eager to discuss terms for her transfer." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Seraphina felt her oracle abilities explode outward in response to the surge of terror and rage that coursed through her system. Visions crashed through her mind with devastating clarity, Marcus coordinating with Eastern Pack operatives, plans drawn up in secret meetings, her own face circled in red on surveillance photographs that stretched back months. But beneath all of that, she glimpsed something that made her soul shatter with betrayal so profound it felt like dying. "Mrs. Chen," she whispered, the name escaping her lips like a prayer for mercy from a god who had already abandoned her. Through her oracle sight, she could see the truth now, the kind elderly woman who had been her anchor during the darkest period of her life, who had helped her find clothes and courage and hope for the future. All of it had been a lie, a carefully constructed performance designed to guide her exactly where the Eastern Pack wanted her to go. Damon felt the exact moment when Seraphina's world crumbled around her, the psychic shock of ultimate betrayal hitting him through their growing bond like a sledgehammer to the chest. "What about Mrs. Chen?" he demanded, his alpha power wrapping around Seraphina like armor as Marcus's smile grew wider and more triumphant. "Oh, you didn't know?" Marcus laughed, the sound sharp enough to cut glass. "Sweet little Mrs. Chen, the volunteer who's been so helpful to all the lost souls at the shelter? She's been working for the Eastern Pack for decades, identifying supernatural refugees and tracking bloodlines that might be useful to their long-term plans. That dress Seraphina's wearing, this ceremony she's attending, even her decision to leave me in the first place, all of it was orchestrated to bring her directly into your path." The revelation hit Seraphina like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs as she realized the full scope of the conspiracy that had shaped her recent life. Mrs. Chen hadn't been a guardian angel sent to help her escape, she'd been a predator wearing the mask of kindness, systematically identifying vulnerable supernatural beings who could be exploited for their abilities or bloodlines. The shelter itself wasn't a sanctuary but a hunting ground, a place where the desperate and broken could be catalogued and evaluated for their potential usefulness. "The blue dress," Seraphina gasped, her oracle abilities showing her the truth behind what she'd thought was simple kindness. "She said it would bring out my eyes, make me look beautiful." But it wasn't about beauty, was it? It was about making sure I'd stand out, making sure you'd notice me across the ballroom. Her voice broke as more visions crashed through her consciousness, Mrs. Chen reporting her every movement, photographing her while she slept, cataloging her behavioral patterns like she was a lab specimen. "Very good," Marcus purred, his satisfaction at her pain radiating outward in waves that made every decent werewolf in the vicinity step back in disgust. "The Eastern Pack has been planning this approach for months. They knew that simply kidnapping you would bring the full weight of Blackthorn Pack justice down on their heads. But if they could manipulate events so that you came to the Alpha King willingly, if they could let nature take its course and allow the mate bond to form naturally, they could use that bond as a weapon," Damon finished, his voice deadly quiet as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. The mate bond was the most sacred connection in werewolf culture, but it was also a vulnerability that could be exploited by those ruthless enough to target an alpha's greatest weakness. Once the bond was complete, attacking Seraphina would be like attacking Damon himself, and the psychological warfare possibilities were endless. Through her oracle sight, Seraphina could see the threads of manipulation that had guided her life for months without her knowledge. Mrs. Chen appearing at the shelter just days after she'd fled from Marcus, offering comfort and practical help that had seemed like divine intervention. The way certain job opportunities had fallen through, certain housing options had become unavailable, gently herding her toward choices that kept her vulnerable and dependent on the shelter's services. Even the timing of the mating ceremony invitation, arriving exactly when her hope was at its lowest point, had been carefully calculated to seem like fate. "Every kindness," she whispered, her voice hollow with the weight of absolute betrayal. "Every gentle word, every moment of comfort when I thought I was finally safe, all of it was manipulation. She held me when I cried about leaving you, Marcus. She helped me practice walking in heels so I wouldn't embarrass myself tonight. She told me I was brave, that I deserved love and happiness and safety." Silver tears streamed down her cheeks as the full emotional impact of the deception hit her. "How long? How long has she been watching me?" Marcus's smile turned predatory as he savored her anguish. "Since before you even met me, actually. The Eastern Pack has been tracking Oracle bloodlines for generations, waiting for the right combination of power and vulnerability to manifest. They knew your grandmother had bound your abilities, knew that the right trigger could awaken them again. I was just the delivery method, a convenient way to keep you isolated and controllable while they prepared their larger plans." The casual admission that even her relationship with Marcus had been orchestrated from the beginning was the final blow that shattered what remained of Seraphina's emotional defenses. Every choice she thought she'd made, every moment of agency she'd believed she possessed, had been an illusion carefully maintained by forces that saw her as nothing more than a valuable resource to be harvested. The oracle abilities that had awakened in Damon's arms weren't a gift, they were a trap, designed to make her irresistible to the most powerful alpha in North America while simultaneously providing her enemies with the perfect weapon to destroy him. Mrs. Chen isn't even human, is she? Seraphina asked, though her oracle sight was already showing her the answer. In her visions, she could see the elderly woman's true form. Something ancient and reptilian that wore human flesh like a comfortable disguise, eyes that held the cold intelligence of a creature that had spent centuries perfecting the art of psychological manipulation. The kindness that had seemed so genuine, the maternal warmth that had made Seraphina feel protected for the first time in years, had all been carefully calculated performances designed to lower her guard and make her pliable. A shape-shifting dragon, actually, Marcus confirmed with obvious pride at the sophistication of their operation. One of the few remaining members of an ancient bloodline that specializes in long-term infiltration and intelligence gathering. She's been running supernatural refugee operations in major cities for decades, identifying valuable targets and guiding them toward situations that benefit her employers. You're just the latest in a very long line of successful acquisitions. As the full scope of the conspiracy became clear, Damon felt something cold and lethal settle in his chest. The Eastern Pack hadn't just targeted his mate, they had systematically destroyed her ability to trust, to believe in genuine kindness, to feel safe in her own choices. The psychological warfare was as sophisticated as it was cruel, designed not just to capture Seraphina but to break her spirit so completely that she would become a willing tool in their hands. "The shelter," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made windows rattle in their frames. How many others? How many vulnerable supernatural beings have been catalogued and exploited through that operation? His alpha power was building to dangerous levels now, the careful control he maintained in public settings beginning to crack under the weight of righteous fury. "Oh, dozens over the years," Marcus replied casually, as if discussing the weather rather than a systematic program of supernatural trafficking. Psychic vampires fleeing abusive covens, teenage witches disowned by traditionalist families, werewolves cast out from their packs for various infractions. The homeless population is surprisingly rich in supernatural talent, if you know where to look. Mrs. Chen has quite the talent for identifying potential and guiding it toward more productive applications. The casual cruelty of using society's most vulnerable populations as hunting grounds for supernatural exploitation made Seraphina's oracle abilities flare with prophetic rage. Through her enhanced sight, she could see the threads of suffering that connected dozens of missing persons cases, supernatural beings who had sought help and found only predators wearing the masks of saviors. The Eastern Pack's operation was vast and sophisticated, a network of false sanctuaries designed to identify and harvest supernatural abilities for their own dark purposes. "But you're the crown jewel," Marcus continued, his attention focused entirely on Seraphina as if Damon's growing fury was merely an inconvenience to be dealt with later. "Oracle blood is the rarest gift in our world, and your particular bloodline carries genetic markers that make your abilities especially potent. Once the Eastern Pack has control of your powers, they'll be able to see every possible future, every potential threat, every weakness in their enemies' defenses. The supernatural world will reshape itself around their will, with you as their unwilling prophet." "Never," Seraphina said, her voice gaining strength as oracle fire blazed behind her gray eyes. "I'll die before I let them use my abilities to hurt innocent people." But even as she spoke, her awakened sight was showing her visions of the future that made her soul recoil with horror. She could see herself chained in a laboratory somewhere, her mind connected to machines that amplified and directed her oracle abilities while Eastern Pack strategists used her visions to plan campaigns of supernatural conquest. "Oh, you won't have a choice in the matter," Marcus laughed, gesturing toward the edges of the ballroom where figures in expensive evening wear were moving with predatory purpose through the crowd. "The neural control collars they've developed are quite sophisticated. You'll retain your oracle abilities but lose any capacity for independent thought or resistance. You'll see exactly what they want you to see, and you'll be grateful for the privilege." As Eastern Pack operatives closed in from multiple directions, Seraphina felt her oracle abilities explode outward with desperate intensity. She could see the immediate future branching into chaos, violence erupting across the ballroom as Damon's pack responded to the threat, innocent ceremony guests caught in the crossfire, blood staining marble floors while ancient alliances crumbled into warfare. But beneath all the visions of destruction, she glimpsed something else, a narrow path through the chaos that might lead to survival. The service elevator behind the eastern tapestry, she whispered urgently to Damon, her oracle sight tracking their enemies' movements with supernatural precision. 30 seconds before they reach optimal positioning. Mrs. Chen is coordinating from the hotel's security office. She's been feeding them information about your pack's defensive protocols all evening. But there's a blind spot in their surveillance, a window of opportunity if we move exactly when I tell you to. Damon's golden eyes blazed with alpha fire as he processed the information, his supernatural senses confirming what Seraphina's oracle abilities had revealed. The scent of Eastern Pack wolves was growing stronger throughout the ballroom, their coordination too precise to be coincidental. Mrs. Chen's betrayal had given them detailed intelligence about his pack's security measures, turning what should have been the safest location in his territory into a carefully prepared trap. 20 seconds, Seraphina continued, her awakened abilities allowing her to track multiple futures simultaneously. Marcus is going to signal the attack, but there's a 3-second delay built into their communication system. If we start moving on my mark, we can reach the elevator before they lock down the building. Her oracle sight was also showing her something else, the faces of Eastern Pack operatives scattered throughout the crowd, some of whom had been posing as legitimate ceremony guests for hours. 10 seconds, she breathed, feeling the weight of destiny pressing down around them like a collapsing star. Through her supernatural sight, she could see the moment approaching when their fates would be decided, escape and face an uncertain future together, or be separated and become pawns in a war that would reshape the supernatural world. Whatever happens next, Damon, I need you to know that meeting you was the first real choice I've made in years. Maybe the only real choice. 5 seconds, Seraphina whispered, her oracle abilities showing her the precise moment when all the variables would align for their escape. Around them, the ballroom continued its elegant dance of supernatural politics and romantic possibility, unaware that they were seconds away from becoming a battlefield. Whatever Mrs. Chen and the Eastern Pack planned, whatever they intended to use our bond for, I choose you. Not because prophecy demands it, not because manipulation guided me here, but because you're the first person who's ever made me feel like I'm worth protecting. Now, she said, and the world exploded into chaos as their desperate flight for freedom began. Chapter 4, The Truth Revealed. The private balcony overlooking the hotel's gardens provided blessed relief from the suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom, though the storm clouds gathering overhead promised that nature was preparing its own dramatic intervention. Seraphina gripped the marble railing with white knuckles, her mind reeling from the revelation that she'd been dancing with the most powerful werewolf in North America. Alpha King Damon Blackthorne, she said, testing the name like it might explode on her tongue. I should have known. The way everyone went silent, the way Marcus backed down without a fight. God, I must have looked like such a fool, clinging to you like some desperate Omega throwing herself at royalty. But even as she spoke, her newly awakened oracle abilities were sending her confusing signals, flashes of memory and emotion that didn't quite align with the man standing beside her. There were layers to his identity that her supernatural sight couldn't quite penetrate, shadows in his aura that spoke of secrets buried so deep they'd become part of his very essence. The name, Damon Blackthorne, felt both perfectly right and somehow incomplete, like a song missing crucial notes that would complete the melody. You looked like someone who needed protection, Damon corrected gently, moving to stand beside her at the railing. His formal jacket hung open now, and she could smell the storm on his skin, wild and electric and dangerous. But there was something else in his scent now, something that made her oracle abilities flutter with confusion. Beneath the pine forests and wild honey that had drawn her to him like a moth to flame, she caught traces of something darker, grief so profound it had carved permanent channels in his soul, and guilt that tasted like ashes and regret. And you still do, he continued, his voice carrying undertones of pain that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than immediate concern for her safety. Marcus isn't going to give up just because I interfered tonight. Men like him see women as possessions, and they don't handle losing their toys very well. The casual way he spoke about her ex-mate's obsession should have been reassuring, but instead it sent ice through her veins. If the Alpha King himself was worried about Marcus's reaction, then her situation was even more dangerous than she'd realized. Through her oracle sight, Seraphina could see threads of destiny swirling around the man beside her, but they were tangled, confused, as if two separate fates had been forcibly woven together in ways that defied the natural order. There were memories that didn't belong to him, emotions that felt borrowed, responses that seemed to come from some other source entirely. The more she tried to focus on his true nature, the more her supernatural senses recoiled with warnings that nothing about this situation was what it appeared to be. "Why did you help me?" Seraphina asked, the question that had been burning in her chest since he'd first approached them on the dance floor. "You could have any Omega in that ballroom. Hell, you could have any Omega in the country. I'm nobody special. Just a blind woman with more baggage than a cargo plane and an ex-mate who's clearly unhinged. What could you possibly want with someone like me?" Her voice broke on the last word, months of feeling worthless and damaged bleeding through despite her attempts to maintain dignity. She'd spent so long believing Marcus's poison that even kindness from a stranger felt like charity. But as she spoke, her oracle abilities were showing her something that made her supernatural awareness recoil with shock. The man standing beside her wasn't responding to her words with his own emotions. He was responding with feelings that belonged to someone else, someone who had loved and lost and died with dreams unfulfilled. The protective instincts, the immediate recognition, the overwhelming need to keep her safe, all of it was filtering through him from some other source, as if he was channeling the ghost of someone who should have been standing in his place. Thunder rumbled overhead as Damon moved closer, his presence wrapping around her like a protective shield against the approaching storm and her own self-doubt. But with each step he took, Seraphina's oracle sight was revealing more disturbing truths about the nature of their connection. The mate bond she felt pulling at her heart wasn't entirely directed at the man in front of her, it was reaching through him towards someone else, someone whose essence was so deeply intertwined with his that separating them would require supernatural archaeology. "Look at me," he commanded softly, and when she turned toward him, he reached out to cup her face in hands that could crush stone but touched her like she was made of spun glass. But the moment his skin made contact with hers, her oracle abilities exploded with visions that made her gasp in shock and recognition. She could see another man, identical in every physical detail but fundamentally different in the depths of his soul, reaching for her across the veil between life and death with desperate longing. "What I see is a woman who survived months of abuse and still found the courage to fight for something better," he said, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones, and she felt tears she hadn't realized were falling. "What I see is an Omega strong enough to leave everything familiar rather than accept a life of fear. What I see is someone who makes my wolf recognize the word, home, for the first time in 5 centuries. But even as he spoke the words, Seraphina's oracle sight was showing her the truth. These weren't his words, weren't his feelings. They belonged to his brother, the real Damon Blackthorne, whose soul was somehow speaking through the man who had taken his place. The truth hit her like lightning splitting the sky. This wasn't just attraction or alpha protectiveness or even simple kindness. The bond she felt pulling at her heart, the way her wolf had calmed in his presence, the sense of rightness that defied all logic and reason. "Mate," she whispered, the word escaping before she could stop it, and watched his golden eyes flare with confirmation and desperate hope. But beneath that hope, her oracle abilities detected something that made her soul ache with sympathy, terror that she was responding to someone who no longer existed, love that was meant for a ghost. "But you're not really Damon Blackthorne, are you?" she said softly, her oracle sight finally piercing through the layers of deception and self-delusion that had hidden the truth for decades. "You're his twin brother. You've been living his life so long you've almost forgotten your own name, but the mate bond recognizes the difference, doesn't it? It's reaching for him, not you." The man who had been calling himself Damon Blackthorne went perfectly still, his hands dropping from her face as if she'd suddenly caught fire. For a moment, his carefully constructed facade cracked completely, revealing the soul-deep exhaustion of someone who had been carrying an impossible burden for far too long. "How did you?" he began, then stopped, his voice breaking on words that had been trapped inside him for 50 years. "Oracle sight sees through all deceptions," Seraphina said gently, her heart breaking for the pain she could see radiating from him in waves. "Even the ones we tell ourselves to survive. What's your real name? What happened to your brother?" But even as she asked, her supernatural abilities were already showing her fragments of the truth. A massacre in the moonlight, Eastern Pack assassins moving like shadows through a forest clearing, two identical brothers fighting back-to-back against impossible odds until only one remained standing. "Damien," he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a confession that had been decades in the making. "My name is Damien Blackthorne, and I watched my brother die 50 years ago in an Eastern Pack ambush that was meant to eliminate our entire bloodline. He was the Alpha King, the one chosen by birth and destiny to lead our people. I was just the spare. The backup plan nobody ever expected to need." The raw anguish in his voice made Seraphina's oracle abilities flutter with sympathetic pain as more visions crashed through her consciousness. She could see the moment when everything changed, Damien cradling his dying brother's body while enemy howls echoed through the forest, making the desperate decision to take Damon's place rather than let their pack fall into chaos. 50 years of living someone else's life, making decisions through the filter of what his brother would have done, carrying the weight of an entire kingdom on shoulders that had never been meant for such responsibility. The Eastern Pack killed him because they knew he would have been too strong to manipulate, Damien continued, his voice hollow with old grief. Damon was everything an Alpha King should be. Confident, decisive, naturally charismatic in ways that made other pack leaders follow him without question. I was always the quiet one, the thinker, the one who preferred books to battlefields. But when they murdered him, someone had to step into his role or watch everything our family had built crumble into civil war. Through her oracle sight, Seraphina could see the incredible sacrifice he'd made, not just taking his brother's place, but gradually allowing his own identity to be subsumed into Damon's until he almost believed the deception himself. The loneliness he'd spoken of, the centuries of searching for a mate who never materialized, suddenly made perfect sense. He'd been living the wrong life, carrying the wrong destiny, and no amount of self-delusion could completely fool the cosmic forces that govern supernatural bonds. "But the mate bond one feel," she said carefully, her oracle abilities still showing her the confusing tangle of destiny that surrounded them both. "It's real, isn't it? Even if it's not meant for you specifically?" The question hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, touching on mysteries that went to the very heart of supernatural existence. Could a mate bond transcend death? Could love intended for one soul find expression through another? Damien's laugh was bitter with 5 decades of accumulated pain. "That's the cosmic joke, isn't it? The bond is absolutely real, but it's Damon's bond, not mine. Your oracle blood recognizes what he would have been to you, the connection you two would have shared if fate hadn't intervened. I'm just the vessel carrying his essence, the placeholder keeping his destiny warm until..." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Until what?" Seraphina pressed, though her oracle sight was already showing her possibilities that made her heart race with terrified hope. Death wasn't always permanent in the supernatural world, especially when cosmic forces like mate bonds were involved. There were rituals, ancient magics, ways of calling back souls that had unfinished business with the living world. But the price for such interventions was always devastating, requiring sacrifices that few were willing to make. Until someone with oracle blood strong enough to pierce the veil between worlds decides whether the dead deserve a second chance, Damien said quietly. "The Eastern Pack knows about your abilities, Seraphina. They know what you could potentially do if you ever learned to fully control your gifts. That's why they've been hunting you, why they orchestrated everything that brought you to this moment. They can't afford to let you discover that the Alpha King they've been planning to overthrow isn't the man they originally tried to kill. The revelation hit her like a physical blow as the full scope of the Eastern Pact's conspiracy became clear. They weren't just planning to use her oracle abilities for their own purposes. They were terrified that she might use those same abilities to expose the deception that had shaped supernatural politics for half a century. If the truth about Damien's identity became public knowledge, it would throw the werewolf kingdom into chaos, creating the perfect opportunity for the Eastern Pact to seize control. But there's more, Damien continued, his voice heavy with guilt that went far deeper than simple deception. The night Damon died, he didn't just pass on his responsibilities to me. He found a way to transfer part of his soul, his essence, his deepest desires and fears. I'm not just pretending to be him, I'm carrying pieces of who he was, what he wanted, what he died before he could accomplish. Including his longing for a mate, his dreams of finding someone who would complete him. Through her oracle sight, Seraphina could see the truth of what he was describing, two souls so thoroughly intertwined that separating them would be like unraveling the fabric of reality itself. Damien wasn't just carrying his brother's identity, he was carrying his brother's heart, his unfulfilled love, his desperate need for connection. The mate bond she felt wasn't a confusion or cosmic mistake, it was exactly what it appeared to be, just directed through channels that defied conventional understanding. So when I respond to you, she said, her voice soft with wonder and growing comprehension, when my soul recognizes yours as home, I'm responding to both of you simultaneously. The man you are and the man he was, the destiny that should have been and the reality that exists now. Her oracle abilities were showing her the beautiful complexity of their connection, not a simple mate bond between two individuals, but a tapestry of love and loss and hope that spanned the boundary between life and death. Which is why the Eastern Pact can't afford to let you live, Damien said bluntly. Your oracle blood doesn't just see the future, it sees the truth behind all supernatural deceptions. If you ever learn to fully control your abilities, you could expose not just my identity but the magical workings that keep Damon's essence anchored to this world. They need you contained, controlled, or eliminated before you become powerful enough to unravel 50 years of carefully maintained stability. As if summoned by his words, Seraphina's oracle sight suddenly exploded with visions of immediate danger. She could see Eastern Pact operatives moving through the hotel with military precision, Mrs. Chen coordinating their assault from the security office while Marcus provided intelligence about escape routes and defensive positions. But beneath all the tactical maneuvering, she glimpsed something that made her supernatural awareness scream with warning: ritual circles being drawn in hidden chambers, ancient symbols carved into surfaces that would channel and amplify her oracle abilities once they captured her. They're not planning to simply kidnap me, she gasped, her visions showing her preparations that looked more like a supernatural laboratory than a prison. They're planning to perform some kind of ritual, something that will force my oracle abilities to show them every possible future, every potential threat to their plans. But the power required for that kind of working. She trailed off as the full horror of what she was seeing became clear. Would require a sacrifice, Damien finished grimly. Something precious enough to fuel magic on that scale. And what could be more precious to an oracle than the mate bond that connects her to the man she loves? His golden eyes blazed with fury that belonged to both brothers as he realized the Eastern Pact's ultimate plan. They would use her love against her, force her to choose between saving herself and protecting the man who carried her destined mate's soul. The storm that had been building all evening finally broke with devastating force, rain lashing against the balcony windows while lightning illuminated their faces in stark relief. But even the fury of nature seemed pale compared to the cosmic forces that were aligning around them: destiny and deception, love and loss, the desperate need to protect what remained of happiness in a world that had already taken so much. There's something else, Seraphina said, her oracle sight showing her one final vision that changed everything. The ritual they're planning, it won't just drain my abilities. It will sever the connection that keeps Damon's essence anchored to this world. If they succeed, you won't just lose me. You'll lose him forever, and with him, any hope of discovering who you really are beneath 50 years of borrowed identity. As the magnitude of what they faced became clear, Damien felt something shift in his chest. Not just his own determination to protect the woman he loved, but his brother's fierce resolve bleeding through their shared connection. For 50 years, he'd lived in Damon's shadow, making decisions based on what his brother would have done. But now, faced with the possibility of losing both his mate and his brother's soul to enemies who understood neither love nor loyalty, Damien Blackthorne was finally ready to discover what he himself was capable of when everything he held dear was on the line. "Then we don't let them succeed," he said, his voice carrying an authority that was entirely his own for the first time in decades. "Whatever it takes, whatever we have to sacrifice, we protect what we found together. Both parts of it, the love that exists now and the love that should have been." As thunder crashed overhead and the storm reached its crescendo, they both realized that their fight for survival was about to become something far more significant, a battle for the very nature of love itself, and whether bonds forged in destiny could survive the forces of deception and despair. Chapter 5: Thunder and Claws. The storm broke just as Marcus burst through the balcony doors, his carefully controlled facade finally cracking to reveal the monster beneath. Rain lashed across the marble terrace as he stalked toward them, his eyes already shifting to their wolf amber and his scent reeking of rage and wounded pride. 5 years, he snarled, his voice distorting as his wolf pushed closer to the surface. 5 years I invested in that broken little bitch, and she thinks she can embarrass me in front of the entire pack hierarchy? You want to play savior, Alpha King? Let's see how much you're willing to sacrifice for damaged goods. Lightning illuminated his face, twisted with the kind of fury that had made Seraphina's life a living hell, and she instinctively pressed closer to Damon's protective warmth. "Seraphina, get inside," Damon commanded, his own alpha power rising to meet Marcus's challenge, the air between them crackling with supernatural tension that made the storm seem tame by comparison. But even as he spoke, Seraphina could smell the change in him, pine forests giving way to something wilder, more primal, the scent of an apex predator preparing for battle. His hands elongated into claws as Marcus partially shifted, muscles bulging beneath his expensive suit while his face took on lupin features that would haunt nightmares. This wasn't going to be a civilized confrontation between gentlemen wolves. This was about to become a bloodbath. "No," Seraphina said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice as she stepped forward instead of retreating. "I'm not running anymore. I'm not hiding while other people fight my battles." The rain soaked through her borrowed dress in seconds, plastering her hair to her skull and making her look like some ancient warrior goddess emerging from the storm. She could feel both males' shock at her defiance, could smell their surprise cutting through the testosterone and fury that charged the air between them. For too long, she'd been a victim, a prize to be won or lost, a broken thing that needed fixing. But standing between two of the most dangerous predators in their world, she finally remembered who she used to be before Marcus had systematically destroyed her confidence. Marcus lunged first, his partially shifted form moving with inhuman speed towards Seraphina, claws extended to finish what he'd started months ago in their apartment. But Damon was faster, his own transformation completing in the space between heartbeats as he intercepted the attack with a roar that shook the building's foundations. The two males collided with a sound like thunder, claws and fangs seeking purchase while they rolled across the rain-slicked marble in a tangle of supernatural fury. Seraphina pressed against the railing, her enhanced hearing tracking every snarl and impact, her heart stopping each time Damon's sense spiked with pain or exertion. The fight ended as suddenly as it had begun, with Marcus's scream cutting through the storm as Damon's jaws found his throat in a hold that promised death if he moved wrong. "Submit," Damon growled, his voice barely human, his golden eyes burning with the promise of violence that had built his reputation across continents. But instead of yielding, Marcus did something that chilled Seraphina to the bone. He laughed. "You think this ends anything?" he gasped around Damon's grip. "You think killing me protects her? I'm not the only one who wants her, Alpha King. The Eastern Pack has been watching, waiting. They know what she is, what she's capable of becoming. You've just painted the biggest target in the world on her back." As his words sank in, Seraphina realized with growing horror that her nightmare was just beginning, and the mate bond that should have been her salvation might have just signed her death warrant. Dawn broke gray and uncertain over the city as Seraphina stood at the window of Damon's penthouse, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of hope and fear. Marcus was gone, exiled from the territory with wounds that would remind him of his defeat for the rest of his life, but his final words echoed in her mind like a curse. The Eastern Pact's interest in her made no sense. She was nobody special, just a blind Omega with a talent for survival and an inconvenient mate bond with the most powerful Alpha in North America. Damon had spent the night making phone calls to allies and enemies alike, trying to piece together the threat that Marcus had revealed, but so far their investigation had yielded more questions than answers. "The safe house is ready," Damon announced from the doorway, his voice carefully controlled despite the exhaustion that clung to him like cologne. He'd barely slept, torn between wanting to hold her close and needing to prepare for whatever storm was coming. The mate bond between them hummed with new strength, forged in violence and sealed with trust, but they both knew that happiness would have to wait until the threat was neutralized. Seraphina turned from the window, memorizing the planes of his face in the morning light, storing up moments of peace against whatever darkness was approaching. "I won't hide forever," she said, echoing her defiance from the balcony but with more warmth now, less desperation and more determination. The woman Marcus had tried to break was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to live in fear. Damon crossed the room to gather her in his arms, his scent wrapping around her like armor against the uncertainty ahead. "We'll figure this out," he promised, his lips brushing against her temple. "Whatever the Eastern Pact wants, whatever you are that makes you so valuable, we'll face it together. You're not alone anymore, Seraphina. You'll never be alone again." As they held each other against the growing light, neither noticed the figure watching from the rooftop across the street, golden eyes identical to Damon's tracking their every movement with predatory patience. The watcher's phone buzzed with an incoming message, "Target confirmed. Bloodline verified. The prophecy can proceed." The Eastern Pact's Alpha smiled, revealing fangs that had tasted the blood of kings, and melted back into the shadows that had hidden him for decades. Seraphina Blackthorn, for that was what she would become, whether she knew it or not, had no idea that her Omega blood carried the genetic key to awakening something that had slept for 1,000 years. Something that would either save their kind or destroy everything they'd built. For the first time in months, Seraphina felt truly safe in Damon's arms, the mate bond singing with contentment and the promise of a future built on love instead of fear. She couldn't see the golden eyes watching from the darkness, couldn't smell the ancient power that marked her observer as something far more dangerous than any rogue Alpha or obsessed ex-mate. As Damon's heartbeat steadied beneath her cheek and the city awakened to another day, Seraphina allowed herself to believe that the worst was behind them. But in the shadows of the supernatural world, another pair of golden eyes had already chosen her fate, and the game that was about to begin would make Marcus's obsession look like a child's tantrum. The real war for Seraphina's soul was just beginning, and not even the Alpha King's protection might be enough to save her from a destiny written in blood and prophecy.